atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by political scientist Michael Levy. Hey, Michael.
Hey, Mike. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. You know, as usual, there were a bunch of things that we didn't get to on the weekend show because so much was happening so quickly. And thankfully, we have this midweek show to talk about a number of these other things that I think were important, but maybe came a little bit under the radar in what was a huge news week last week. And why don't we start with the Supreme Court? On January 13th, the court heard two cases concerning whether transgender females have a right to play on women's sports teams. And the states in this case, Idaho and West Virginia, their argument is that their respective laws banning this participation should stand, arguing that it's been long the case that states can separate sports by biological sex due to reasons that relate to fairness, safety, and what you might call administratability. Now, the challengers here claim that Title IX, which prevents sex discrimination within educational institutions that receive federal funds, as well as the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, protect individuals, not groups, and that if the evidence shows that no relevant physiological differences for a specific trans athlete are in play here, well, there's no lawful basis to exclude them. Now, based on the oral arguments, they lasted nearly 3.5 hours. It seems likely that the court's going to rule for Idaho and West Virginia in this case, which really kind of pits individual rights against the interests of the states. And I have struggled with this issue for years now because I feel for the trans girls, trans women who have been denied the right to participate in sports due to their gender identification, which I see that as a lived reality and not a choice or not a way to game the system or anything like that. And of course, over 20 states, I believe it is, allow trans women to participate in women's sports, which makes me think that there's a way to balance the interests of the trans women and the states, I believe, valid concerns for fairness, safety, and administratability. But that's not really the question here, at least not quite. The question here is whether Idaho and West Virginia can ban trans women from participating in men's sports without violating Title IX or the Equal Protection Clause. So, Michael, do you expect these bans to be upheld? And if they are, do you think that that's the right legal judgment here in this case before we get into policy?
Yeah, so the reporting from the oral arguments, as you said, does suggest that the majority is going to let stand the Idaho and West Virginia laws. And if that's where it goes, I think that we should be clear-eyed about what the court is actually doing. To me, it simply wouldn't be protecting women's sports in some abstract sense. It would, in effect, be endorsing a blanket exclusion of a small, already stigmatized group, while declining to consider narrower evidence-based alternatives. So I want to be clear about something. You said you struggle, and sports are a hard case for me, because when you get into the debate on bathrooms and such, I get so angry because they're just total fear-mongering and transphobia. Right. And listeners to past might know that when this is discussed, I can't let it go. I'm a dog with a bone. If you say stuff like that, I'm just not going to let you get away with it. But athletics involves bodies, and sex-linked differences, physical differences can matter depending upon the sport, the level of competition, the stage of puberty. And especially at or after puberty, the jury is still out in some contexts. And reasonable people, including people acting in good faith, can debate how eligibility should work. But to me, that's not what's happening here. Legally, the challengers, as you said, that they're arguing equal protection and Title IX. And the common sense progressive view here is that when a state singles out transgender girls who already face disproportionate harassment and denies them access to public education programs, that's discrimination. That should trigger some serious constitutional scrutiny, not reflexive deference to legislatures. And what really struck me when reading about the oral arguments, I didn't listen to them, was not just where the court seems to be headed, but what it barely engaged with. The justices spent a lot of time talking about who should decide, the courts or legislatures, but very little time grappling with what these laws actually do in practice. The court talked about fairness, largely ignoring the fact that bans sweep in kids who pose no competitive threat. The court also treated scientific uncertainty as a reason to defer to legislatures. And I do want to mention one thing before I throw it back to you, which is what stood out to me was Justice Gorsuch. The conservative justice, he wrote the Bostock decision in 2020, which said that discrimination against transgender people counts as sex discrimination. But here, in this case, he really didn't lean in at all. His questions made it sound like he sees sports as a special case, and perhaps it is, where I think he's leaning towards supporting the majority and supporting the laws to stay intact, where courts should step back rather than extend. Should the court do? In my view, it's going to uphold, but I hope that when it does uphold, that it should reject blanket bans and hold that states cannot impose exclusion under equal protection in Title IX. I'm hoping that it's a rather narrow decision rather than one that could open the floodgates to other discrimination. Whatever the court decides, the political work going forward has to insist on a core idea of fairness in sports being taken seriously while turning a very small, very vulnerable group of kids not into symbolic targets for a political fight between adults. And to me, that's the moral line and I fear that it's one that the court is going to cross.
I think they will. I don't necessarily expect this to be a narrow decision. And I guess where I come down in the end is as a matter of policy. I am a supporter of state laws that allow trans girls to participate in girls' athletics at K through 12. At the college level, how it generally works is the NCAA handles things, and I think that's more or less okay. I'm good with that. But as a matter of law, I think that I side more with Idaho and West Virginia. But just to say that a state can do something doesn't mean that they should do it or it's a good policy. And I guess the real problem for me here is someone loses or someone potentially loses either way. It's not like this is fair, this is unfair sort of thing, because there is a legitimate competitive fairness argument that the states make. But there also is a legitimate argument for these trans girls saying, well, what am I supposed to do then? If I just can't play sports because of the larger state interest, and that sucks, that's not fair either. So, and how most states do it that allow trans girls to play women's sports is that self-identification is all you need to do. There's no testing or anything like that, because when you start thinking about it, I mentioned administratability in this context. And here's the problem on a very real level. If you say, well, if you believe that when there are no significant physiological differences between a biological female and a biological male who identifies as female, at least no differences that matter in terms of participation in a sport, competitive advantage, that sort of thing, well, then who determines what differences should and shouldn't be considered? I mean, who bears the burden of demonstrating that these differences are or aren't significant? Justice Thomas made a kind of tone-deaf argument in oral arguments about, well,
Shocking.
What if allows, well, the fact that he spoke was one thing, but not surprising, it maybe wasn't a good argument. But he talked about, well, what about a lousy male tennis player who basically wants to game the system and become a female tennis player? Anyway,
But this is
go ahead.
I was going to say, this is where I get so angry, is because, you start bringing up straw man arguments.
Yeah.
And about again, sort of go back to the bathroom. Oh, it's going to be these pervert, men who say that they're a woman just to go in a bathroom. What kid who's 14 years old, knowing how bullying happens at school and how trans kids are so bullied and so susceptible to self-harm and psychological damage, that some straight boy who thinks he can beat girls, this is not a Joanna Man movie, right?
Yeah.
That they're going to somehow say that they're trans just so that they can beat girls in tennis. I mean, it's just, it defies any logic. But again, like there are physical differences. And that's where treating it more on a case by case and maybe sport by sport basis is the way to go. Swimming is a non-contact sport. I can kind of maybe get it if you're talking about field hockey. Again, I'm not saying that I support the Idaho, West Virginia law, but I could see people acting in good faith to separate contact sports from non-contact sports.
Yeah. Well, and here's the problem, because if you say, and I think it's a reasonable argument to say that these rights are individual rights, not group rights. And so therefore, if an individual can say, listen, I gain no competitive advantage here, but there's none of these differences come into play in this specific sport. You should let me play. There's no reason not to. I am so sympathetic to that argument. But then I thought about the administratability thing, because what sort of things will we have to look at? Well, things like presumably bone density, lung capacity, hormone levels, muscle size, reaction time, maybe some other things. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But I tried to put together a rough estimate of what it would cost to test for these things. Now, I'm no healthcare expert or economist or anything, so grain of salt here. But when I tried to figure out what testing for all these things would be, it would be somewhere, I think, between $2,000 and $4,500 per athlete, and monitoring costs for subsequent years between $1,000 and $2,500. And you couldn't just test the trans athletes, because once you start doing that, then you get into a serious equal protection clause issue as well. So you're requiring that a certain class of people undergo invasive and time-consuming tests, and other people don't have to do that. It's setting up a two-tiered system where one class is just presumed eligible and another has to demonstrate that eligibility. So I don't know how that works in practice, which is why I think on a policy level, the smartest thing is for states to just allow this, and to let the school districts and to let the local authorities work this out. But it seems like because of this whole anti-trans hysteria, I'll call it, on the right, that's not possible. And I don't know if legislators are serious about this or they're just trying to score points. It really doesn't matter. But this kind of idea that trans kids are doing this to be trendy, that it's like some crazy spur-of-the-moment choice. Oh, I think I'll be a girl this week. I mean, I find that so deeply, deeply offensive, which is why I have a hard time sort of saying I think this is legal, because I certainly don't want to associate myself with the people who think that this is a wise policy, because I think it's just awful.
Yeah. And I think we both agree that the law is going to be upheld. And you're right. I also agree that it's not going to be a narrow decision. I expect it to be a minimum of 6-3. I think all of the Republican appointed judges. I'm not 100% sure about Elena Kagan. I think she might be in the majority, but we'll see. But more broadly, I think this introduces something that we've talked about on a previous show, that parents of trans kids are going to likely have to make some really difficult choices about where they live and the safety of their kids. And we talked in a previous show about a family moving from Tennessee to Connecticut. I would not be surprised for those few trans athletes that their parents, if they're living in a state where these laws exist, that they may need to uproot themselves, not just to play sports, but also to protect the safety of their kids. And I think that's the thing that does get me the most exercise is we're talking about a very small percentage of people, a very small percentage of kids. And then, with all of the challenges and difficulties that kids face regardless, and then layering this on top of it, it's just one more psychological duress that these kids and the families that love them are going to face.
Yeah, and so much of this is just driven by memes and vibes and that sort of thing, and understandably so, because like you said, we're talking about really low numbers. I mean, oftentimes low double digits in an entire state of these instances. And the problem is it's really hard to get verified evidence of a clear competitive disadvantage or safety concerns for these instances. And so we're kind of doing this in the dark, but it's not like the state high school record books are being rewritten by trans females. That's just simply not the case. And I hate to be supportive of something that can bolster these kind of what I feel to be fraudulent and in some ways disgusting culture war arguments that really target trans kids who are, like you said, already have such a difficult time. But on the other hand, again, as a matter of law, Justice Alito in oral arguments said, listen, we really need to, it's important for us to define what sex means in this context. And I agree with him. This is a word that has to have a meaning. And for me, with how I approach legal and constitutional interpretation, that means what it meant to the people who passed the legislation in 1972, Title IX, and then the Javits Amendment in 74, which is the one that allowed for that sort of carve-outs for sports, essentially, which, and to me, I think to those folks, it seems clear to me it meant biological sex and not gender orientation. Now, that would not be my interpretation today in 2025, but I feel sort of bound by that. I would love to see it to be amendments to Title IX that make it very clear that trans kids are a specific class that needs to be protected here. But that's not the legislation we have, and I'm always so wary of reading into legislation what I think is right as opposed to what the legislators of the time actually passed there. We hope you enjoyed this preview of our supporters-exclusive midweek show. If you'd like to hear the rest of the episode, we hope you'll consider becoming a supporter. Supporters get ad-free access to all of our shows, membership in our Politics Guys Discord group where you can join in on the conversation, and other benefits at different levels of support. To become a supporter, go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo or @politicsguys or through PayPal. You'll find all of our support links in the show notes as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And if you'd like to get the midweek show, but you're not in a position to become a financial supporter, that's not a problem. Just send me an email at mike@politicsguys.com, and I'll be happy to get that set up for you.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,